Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? It helps us make quality content for you. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. The chainsaw's roar echoed across the quiet suburban street, a deafening contrast to the peaceful neighborhood that had once thrived on a sense of community. In the fading light of a summer evening, I stood frozen on my front porch, watching as the workers from the HOA cut into my beloved oak tree. The one that had stood tall and proud for over 50 years, my family's tree. Its branches stretched high above, its roots tangled in the soil like memories. And now, all of that was being stripped away piece by piece, under the orders of someone who had never cared about any of it. Just get it over with. I muttered under my breath, clenching my fists at my sides. My heart beat furiously, the sound of the chainsaw slicing through the trunk hammering in my chest. I could already smell the fresh, bitter scent of cut wood in the air, the sharpness of it stinging my nostrils. It was a small death, but it felt like the loss of everything. "Hey!" a voice shouted from across the street, sharp and smug. "That's the one." I turned my head slowly, my stomach sinking. There, standing on her manicured lawn in front of a gleaming White House, was Karen. Karen. The woman who had made herself the self-appointed ruler of our neighborhood, wielding her HOA membership like a sledgehammer. She stood tall in her designer clothes, arms crossed over her chest, staring at me with a look of self-satisfaction that could make anyone's blood boil. Her bleach-blonde hair caught the light as she raised her chin slightly, as if she could almost taste the victory she was savoring. The sight of her was like a slap to the face. "You're really going through with this?" I called across the street, my voice tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. She shot me a look, her lips curling into a thin, disinterested smile. The HOA's decision was final. The tree's roots are damaging property, and it's a safety hazard. You really should have taken care of this yourself. Her words dripped with condescension, and I could feel my blood boil. I had tried. I'd sent emails. I'd made phone calls. I had even invited her to meet me and discuss a compromise. But Karen wasn't interested in reason, only in power. The tree, which had stood proudly for generations, was now an inconvenience to her. The roots, she claimed, might be damaging the foundation of her driveway, a driveway where her prized convertible parked in the sun every afternoon. And that, in Karen's eyes, was enough to justify the destruction of something irreplaceable. "Are you seriously going to just sit there and watch?" I snapped, my voice thick with frustration. Karen's lips twitched into something approaching a smirk. "What's done is done. It's not my fault your tree didn't meet HOA guidelines. You've had ample warning. Now stop making a scene. You're only making it worse for yourself." The words stung, each one an insult to everything I had tried to do to keep this from happening. But as much as I wanted to rush across the street and scream in her face, I knew better. The last thing I needed was to give her more ammunition to use against me. I turned away, trying to steady myself, but all I could see was the tree, my tree, beginning to topple under the force of the chainsaw. Each cut seemed louder than the last. The workers were halfway through the trunk when I heard the sound of tires screeching, followed by a sudden stop. A car pulled up to the curb with a quiet purr, its sleek, polished surface gleaming in the last rays of the day's sunlight. Karen's eyes flicked toward it, and she made a noise in her throat, half satisfaction, half anticipation. And there it was. Her prized convertible, the one she'd flaunted like a crown jewel, parked in front of my house. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the pavement, and in one swift motion she opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. I could see the gleam in her eyes, the unspoken expectation that, now that the tree was gone, her world would return to its pristine, untroubled state. I couldn't take it anymore. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "This is my family's home. My tree." But Karen didn't hear. She didn't care. Her gaze was focused solely on the workers now, watching them carefully as if she were overseeing the work of her personal minions. There was no empathy in her expression, no acknowledgement of the sentimental value this tree held. It was just another obstacle to her perfect life. "Isn't it a little late for you to be worrying about this?" Karen called out, her voice high-pitched and cutting. "You had your chance. You had months to sort it out. Now you're just wasting everyone's time." I clenched my fists again, feeling the heat of frustration rise inside me. I had been through this before, Karen's blatant disregard for anyone else's feelings, her obsession with control, her unshakable belief that she was always right. It didn't matter what I said or how I fought back. She was above the law, and the HOA was her weapon. "Don't you dare act like I'm the one at fault here," I shouted, my voice shaking with the effort to remain calm. "You're the one forcing this. You're the one who's making everyone's lives miserable. Karen paused, glancing over at me with a look of mock sympathy, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "You're making it so much harder on yourself, you know that?" she said, her voice sickly sweet. "You should have just accepted the HOA's decision. Now look at you. This is all your fault." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure, but I could feel the walls closing in around me. The sound of the chainsaw seemed to grow louder, cutting into my resolve. The tree was almost gone, and Karen's smug expression was the last thing I would see before the final blow. But then something inside me snapped. I could no longer just stand by and watch her destroy everything. There had to be a way to make her see what she had done. There had to be a way to make her regret ever crossing me. With a sudden clarity, I realized that direct confrontation wasn't going to work. I needed to be smarter. I needed to play the game her way, and then I would make sure she would never forget who she had underestimated. The chainsaw's whine echoed one last time, and as the tree's final branch came crashing down, I turned away, my mind already racing with possibilities. Karen had no idea what was coming next. The following days felt like a blur of frustration and quiet simmering anger. I watched helplessly as the remnants of the oak tree were chipped away into mulch, its twisted branches now reduced to piles of kindling, and its proud trunk sliced into manageable logs. The workers were gone, but the damage they left behind lingered. The once beautiful tree stump stood as a painful reminder of the fight I had lost, at least on the surface. But beneath the crushing weight of defeat, something stirred. A thought. A plan. I could feel the itch in the back of my mind, that nagging sensation that told me I wasn't done yet. I wasn't going to let Karen, get away with this. Not without paying a price. She had taken so much from me, but she didn't know just how far I was willing to go to make sure she felt the weight of her actions. I sat at my kitchen table one evening, staring at the pile of paperwork I had gathered on Karen over the past week. HOA documents, complaints from neighbors, and photographs of her social media posts. All the little crumbs that painted a picture of a woman who saw herself as untouchable beyond reproach. She had the power, she had the luxury, and most importantly, she had the ego. It was that last part that I needed to exploit. Karen wasn't some faceless figure in the bureaucracy of our neighborhood. No, she was very much the self-appointed queen of it. She loved to flaunt her status, posting pictures of her perfectly manicured garden and her immaculately clean house. But the real jewel in her crown, the one she never stopped talking about, was her convertible. The car she drove with such pride, always parked in the sun in front of her pristine house, always the perfect backdrop for her Instagram selfies. I scrolled through her social media feed again, each image more obnoxious than the last. She'd posed in front of that car more times than I could count, captioning each post with hashtags like #LivingMyBestLife, #blessed, and my personal favorite, #QueenOfTheNeighborhood. I smirked as an idea began to take shape in my mind. If Karen cared about one thing more than her power, it was her image. Her carefully curated life, her flawless facade, and the attention she garnered from every perfectly staged photo. What if I could pull back that veil? What if I could use her obsession with perfection against her? I leaned forward, my fingers flying over the keyboard as I started to dig deeper. Karen had a history, one that she had carefully crafted to appear spotless. But in the age of social media, there were always cracks. I found her public posts, yes, but I also uncovered her private ones. The ones where she shared offhand comments about neighbors she had a grudge against, petty complaints about the lawn care, and most damning of all, her rants about difficult residents who didn't follow the rules. I made copies of it all, screenshots and notes that could paint a picture of a woman who wasn't just overbearing, she was downright tyrannical. But I needed more. I needed to turn the tide, to make her the villain in this story, not me. And that meant bringing others into the fold. I reached out to a few neighbors, those who had long been fed up with Karen's petty power trips. Jane, the single mother down the street who'd received fines for the smallest infractions. Mark, the retired veteran whose dog had been cited for barking too loud during the day. The stories they shared were eerily similar. Karen's constant interference, her unsolicited advice, her refusal to let anyone live in peace unless they bowed to her whims. All of it was grist for the mill. They didn't need much convincing. I showed them the evidence I had, and one by one they agreed to join in. They were done just as I was with living under Karen's thumb. But this wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. This wasn't about storming her house or confronting her directly. That would be a disaster. No, I was going to do this the smart way. I was going to expose her for what she was, and in the process make sure everyone knew it. Over the next few days I began quietly organizing. I reached out to local news outlets, alerting them to the growing number of complaints about Karen and her iron-fisted rule over the neighborhood. I compiled the evidence, the fines, the arbitrary rules, and her abusive use of the HOA as a tool to punish anyone who didn't fit her perfect mold. I even included screenshots from her social media accounts that painted a picture of a woman obsessed with appearances. But I wasn't done yet. Karen's own words would be her downfall. I had found a post, buried deep in her feed, where she casually mentioned how much she loved her new, perfectly paved driveway, the very one that, according to her claims, was threatened by the tree's roots. She had openly mocked the idea that the tree could ever pose a risk to anything, not when it was so far from her precious car. She'd said it was just a hassle, and that the HOA should have dealt with it years ago. The irony was too perfect. I wasn't just going to expose Karen's hypocrisy, I was going to destroy her carefully crafted image. The next step was to go viral. I started a blog, anonymous of course, and posted the story of my fight with Karen. The blog outlined the absurdity of her demands, included the screenshots of her social media posts, and laid out the complaints of neighbors who were too afraid to speak up on their own. I told my side of the story, highlighting how my tree, my family's legacy, had been needlessly destroyed by a woman too obsessed with her image to see the bigger picture. Then, I posted the link on every social media platform I could think of. I shared it in local Facebook groups, on neighborhood message boards, and in HOA-related forums. Within hours, the story spread like wildfire. The first comment I saw was from Jane. I thought I was the only one who noticed. She's been doing this for years. And then Mark chimed in. I had no idea this was happening to others. She's been terrorizing my block for months. Karen had no idea what was coming. The power she had so smugly wielded over the neighborhood was slipping from her grasp, and I was watching it happen, one click at a time. The ball was now in motion, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. The damage had already been done. Now it was time to sit back and watch the show. The tension in the air thickened with each passing day. What had begun as a personal frustration had now turned into something much larger. Karen had no idea what was unfolding around her. Her carefully curated life was beginning to crack. The story I had started was spreading, and the dominoes were starting to fall, one after the other. The first blow came when the local news outlet picked up the story. A small but determined reporter had caught wind of the growing controversy over the tree's destruction and Karen's reign as HOA enforcer. The headline read, Suburban Power Struggle. Neighbors speak out against HOA overreach. The article was unflattering, painting a picture of a community under siege by a petty tyrant. It wasn't long before Karen's social media posts, the very ones she had once posted with such pride, became the fuel for a fire she didn't know how to extinguish. Karen's first reaction was predictable. I could almost hear her shrill voice screeching as she scrolled through the article. I knew that she'd been monitoring the situation for days, but this was different. The article went viral. It was shared by hundreds of people. Neighbors, former residents, even strangers who had never set foot in our neighborhood but could relate to her overbearing behavior. Her carefully constructed image of the perfect, suburban life was beginning to unravel. The calls to the HOA started pouring in. Neighbors, emboldened by the growing support, began airing their grievances, not just about Karen's treatment of them, but about the HOA's overall control over their lives. The complaints piled up, arbitrary fines, unfair enforcement of minor violations, and a sense that Karen had turned the neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. The pressure was mounting, and I could see the cracks in her facade growing wider. Karen, of course, didn't take this lying down. The next morning, I received an email from her, a furious, venomous diatribe accusing me of stirring up trouble and destroying the harmony of the neighborhood. The tone was condescending, the words sharp with venom. She threatened legal action, claiming that I had defamed her and violated her privacy by sharing her social media posts. I could almost hear her voice in the email, trembling with rage. But I didn't respond. Instead, I took another step in my plan. I knew she wouldn't back down easily. Karen was too proud for that. And that pride would be her undoing. Behind the scenes, the cracks were spreading and Karen didn't know it. A few of the more influential neighbors, who had once been too intimidated to speak out, were beginning to organize. Jane and Mark, whom I had already spoken with, were joined by others who had suffered under Karen's reign. They were ready to confront the HOA head-on, demanding accountability for Karen's actions. This wasn't just about the tree anymore, it was about the future of their neighborhood, about reclaiming the sense of community that had been destroyed by one woman's obsession with power. The tipping point came when I received an anonymous tip from someone within the HOA office. A whistleblower. They had seen Karen's influence over the organization firsthand and had access to emails that proved she'd used her position to target certain residents, fining them for trivial infractions while letting others slide. It was a pattern and it was illegal. The whistleblower had copies of the emails and they were willing to hand them over. I couldn't believe it. This was the break I needed. The next step was calculated. I met with the whistleblower in person under the cover of darkness to retrieve the documents. Their hands shook as they handed over the files, and I could see the fear in their eyes. "I just want this to end," they whispered. I nodded, grateful for their courage, and promised them that they wouldn't be alone in this. The emails I received painted a damning picture. There were messages from Karen to the HOA board, directing them to pursue fines and penalties against specific residents based on personal vendettas. There were letters from her to contractors, subtly threatening them if they didn't comply with her vision of a perfect neighborhood. Everything she had done was now laid bare, and it was worse than I could have imagined. I couldn't wait any longer. I knew it was time to take the next step. I contacted a local investigative journalist, someone who had already covered stories on HOA corruption in nearby towns. I showed her the emails, explained everything, and urged her to take a closer look. The moment I handed over the documents, I could see the shift in her eyes. She was hooked. The journalist assured me she would run with the story, but she needed a few days to confirm everything. As the journalist worked her sources, Karen's behavior grew more erratic. Her usual posts on social media, full of self-congratulation and perfect photos, became more defensive. She started to lash out in the comments, claiming that the media was spreading lies, that her neighbors were jealous of her success. But the more she posted, the more people turned against her. Her followers, who had once praised her for her spotless lawn and shiny car, began to question her motives. It was clear that the tide was turning. Finally, the journalist's story went live. The headline was explosive. Corruption, favoritism, and abuse of power. The HOA leader who ruined a neighborhood. The article was a bombshell. It detailed Karen's manipulation of the HOA for personal gain, her targeting of certain residents, and the way she had used her position to punish those who didn't fall in line. The story included the damning emails, quotes from former residents, and even an interview with Jane and Mark, who had finally found their voices. Karen was exposed. The truth was out and there was no turning back. Within hours, the comments section was flooded with people condemning her actions. Former neighbors shared their own stories, others expressed their shock and disgust at her behavior. And the HOA? They had no choice but to act. The board members, who had once been too afraid to stand up to Karen, were now scrambling to distance themselves from her. I watched as the news of her downfall spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a neighborhood issue anymore, it was a local scandal. Karen's pristine image had shattered, and all that was left was a woman clinging desperately to her power. But even she could feel the walls closing in. Her downfall was imminent, and she didn't even see it coming. The final unraveling came faster than anyone could have anticipated. Karen's fortress of lies, built over years of manipulation and petty rulemaking, was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the days following the explosive news article, I could feel the atmosphere of the neighborhood shift. The tension was palpable. Karen, once the queen of the block, had been dethroned. The floodgates of truth had opened, and she couldn't control the narrative anymore. Her phone, which had once buzzed with constant praise, now rang only with criticism, legal inquiries, and the occasional harassing call. But the worst blow came when the HOA board finally moved against her. The pressure from the residents, the media storm, and the undeniable evidence of her abuse of power had left them with no choice. They held a meeting to formally vote her out of her position as president, a move that sent shockwaves through the community. I knew it was coming, but even the most prepared plans have their moments of finality. The meeting was packed, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. Everyone who had once been too scared to speak up now gathered in force, their voices rising in unity against the woman who had bullied them into submission. Karen arrived late, her usual air of superiority replaced by a nervous edge that no amount of luxury or designer clothing could hide. I watched her as she entered, her steps slow and deliberate, like a lion who knew it was about to be caged. She had always carried herself with the pride of someone who believed they were invincible. That was no longer the case. The whispers that swirled around her were like the winds before a storm, each one a reminder of her fall from grace. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stood before the HOA board, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. There was no trace of the confident, almost smug woman who had once held everyone under her thumb. Now there was only desperation, an attempt to salvage what little of her control remained. "I've worked hard for this neighborhood," she began, her voice faltering as she tried to regain some semblance of power. "I've made decisions that have been in the best interest of everyone here. Yes, I may have made some mistakes, but I was trying to keep things in order." But she was cut off, the voice of one of the longtime residents cutting through her words like a blade. "No, Karen. You've made decisions to serve yourself, not us," Jane said, standing tall in the crowd. "We've all been living in fear of you for years. It's time we take back our neighborhood." The room erupted in applause, the overwhelming force of the community's support sending Karen reeling. I could see her eyes darting around, trying to find some escape, some way to salvage the pieces of her shattered empire. But it was too late. One by one, the board members cast their votes to remove her. She stood there, frozen, as the weight of her downfall pressed in on her like a vice. When the final vote came through, it was a landslide. Karen was no longer the HOA president. She was nothing more than a disgraced figure, standing alone in a room full of people who had once feared her. Her face turned crimson with humiliation, and I could see the tremor in her hands as she stepped away from the board. She turned to face the crowd one last time, her expression one of rage and disbelief. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her usual venomous retorts seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a raw, unfiltered panic. "Get out," someone shouted from the back. The command echoed through the room, a final rejection of her rule. Karen, her shoulders slumped, her head hanging low, turned and walked toward the door. It wasn't the graceful exit she had imagined for herself. There was no applause, no admiration. There was only the sound of her high heels clicking on the floor, growing fainter with each step. As she left, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality wash over me. It wasn't just her removal from the HOA that had brought this victory, it was the way the entire neighborhood had come together. We had all watched her crumble under the weight of her own arrogance, but more than that, we had reclaimed our sense of community. The unspoken fear that had haunted us for so long had dissipated. We weren't just free of Karen. We were free of the control that had seeped into every aspect of our lives. The aftermath was swift. The story made headlines for days, with people from all over the area commenting on how a single person's greed and ego had torn apart an entire community. The journalist who had helped expose Karen's actions became a local hero, and the HOA board members, now freed from Karen's grasp, began working to restore some sense of fairness to the neighborhood. A new president was elected, one who promised to listen to the residents, not rule over them. As for Karen, I never saw her again. I heard whispers, of course, rumors that she had moved to another city, that she had sold her beloved convertible, and that the life she had so carefully curated had crumbled around her. She had become a punchline in the neighborhood, a cautionary tale of power gone unchecked. But there was one moment I'll never forget. The day the tree finally came down, the one Karen had been so obsessed with, the one she had insisted had to go. The workers had come and gone, but what remained was not just an empty lot but a symbol of victory. It was the place where I had stood strong, where I had fought for what was right, and where I had made sure that Karen's version of justice was crushed beneath the weight of her own arrogance. I walked to the stump one last time, my heart swelling with a sense of finality. The tree might be gone, but the message was clear. No one was untouchable, not even Karen. The sun set over the now empty space where the tree had stood, casting long shadows across the grass. I smiled, knowing that, for once, the right person had lost and the rest of us had won. The neighborhood was ours again.